Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Torghast was the infamous roguelike side activity during Shadowlands that much of the player base grew to hate. The activity was likely developed on the coattails of the genre's popularity, and the potential mileage to be gained out of it. The genre revolves entirely around somewhat randomized power-ups that you obtain during any given run that are wiped out afterwards to be replaced by a new selection of powers next run, often with a supporting back end of permanent upgrades to maintain a sense of progression. Torghast had both of these features to an extent, and I can see Blizzard's reasoning. I myself wound up playing the roguelike Hades, released just 2 months before Shadowlands, and played it enough to complete every achievement and earn every cosmetic reward other than the prestige ranks. I can confidently say it's in my top 10 games of all time, and I eagerly anticipate getting to play Hades 2 after it officially releases. So I can see why Blizz believed in Torghast, and I don't think they were wrong to do so. But I do think it was mismanaged to an extent. In this video, I'll be covering how I think Torghast could have been implemented to much more fanfare without drastically overall changing the development process, and I think there were 3 core changes needed. Remove player power as a reward, diversify the environments, and then redirect Torghast assets into other areas of the game. Firstly, and most importantly, was to remove the power rewards, making it purely cosmetic. This is my stance for most forced side activities in WoW. What the majority of players want is to not have to do anything outside of dungeons, raids, and perhaps some light open world questing. On Blizzard's end, I can understand the fear that lots of development time may go into something only for it to not get a ton of attention, for both creative pride and for optimal investment of resources. But it's something that you just have to accept because it's better than poisoning your players to hate what you've given them. Rest assured though, if you stick the right cosmetics on something, players like me will flock to an activity, especially if they are free to do so on their own time and at their own pace. What's more, if the rewards are difficult to obtain, they will become a bit of a bragging item, which in turn can motivate other players to participate. And in Torghast's case, I'm very confident that it would have been the right move. Beta tester reception to the activity was very positive, and the most common complaint in the live game was just that it was a mandatory weekly activity, that it had become Torghast. Furthermore, the optional modes that were added were much better received. Twisting Corridors was a wing that essentially had you run 3 consecutive normal wings for 18 floors total, 12 trash floors, 3 vendor floors, and 3 boss floors, with you carrying over all of your anima powers, but with enemies scaling up higher as well. The Jailer's Gauntlet was more of a boss rush, with most of the trash removed outside of what spawned with the boss fights that you would be thrown into. Both awarded nothing but cosmetics, and neither received the scorn that the main Torghast wings did. And if the overall vibe around Torghast had been more positive, it may have had a chance of being carried forward. Either way, it's more important to keep your player base happy and lightly engaged with the game than unhappy and heavily engaged. The second important change to make would just be to diversify the environments. The many rooms of Torghast that you can semi-randomly wind up visiting actually look pretty interesting and offer some cool experiences, but absolutely nobody feels that way simply because we were overexposed to them. The 6 different wings of Torghast, as well as the adamant vaults you were eventually able to visit as the 7th and 8th floor of another run, did have characteristics that marked them as distinct from one another, most notably different color palettes, but they were still samey enough that I doubt most players even realized this. The overall aesthetic from all the wings was just very unified. Too unified for something that was intended to be done all expansion long. And these aesthetics were also used to an extent in the Maw and the Sanctum of Domination raid. We were just inundated with cold metal and torture for far too long. This is a very quick way to cause aesthetic burnout in your roguelike mode. Even Hades, for example, which takes place pretty much entirely in the underworld, managed to give its 4 biomes a better diversity of design and swatches. The solution here was simply to not place your roguelike game mode in Torghast. I hate to over-rely on the Bronze Dragonflight for any slightly out there gameplay, as it has already been utilized for Chromie Time Rifts, Mob Remix, and much of the 20th anniversary event, but it would have worked well here. Simply come up with some nonsense reason that the timeways have gotten all tangled up and we need to venture between different locations and different timelines to straighten matters up. This would allow them to use literally any zone and any tile set in the game and not have us go numb from the different shades of gray everywhere. Of course, I'd be happy to have it tied to something else lore-wise, especially with dragons not being particularly relevant for Shadowlands. But honestly, with how much other areas of Shadowlands needed more love, I think postponing the feature until Dragonflight would have been an okay move as well. My last change has less to do with Torghast the activity and more to do with Torghast the location. And that would be to redirect what we did get out of Torghast into dungeons and a better raid. I think that if we were to divorce the two, then we have some room for more exposure to the location without risking such colossal fatigue. There were 7 wings worth of assets that we have to work with here. If we go based off of their entrances in the lobby, then the lowest among these would be Skoldus Halls, which the game describes as but one of Torghast's countless cell blocks. Warden Skoldus utilizes beasts, chains, and traps to torment his prisoners, as well as those who intrude upon his domain. This section was probably the closest to what people imagine when they think of Torghast. Lots of cold blue metal and lots of moss-worn enemies. Moving up, we had the Fracture Chambers, where prisoners from across the Shadowlands have their bones endlessly broken and mended in a cruel cycle of torture. Release them so they might claim their vengeance. This wing was relatively similar to Skoldus Halls, but a lot more green and had a lot more necromancy going on. Above that, we had the Soul Forges, where doomed souls are brought to be melted down into weapons and armor for the jailer's army. Beware the rampant flames that burn within these halls. And this was definitely the most visually distinct of all of Torghast's wings, as it is the one filled with fire and lava. And even the rooms that stick to the more standard metal halls have a definite red and orange tint to them. Further still, we had Coldheart Interstitia, where, suspended between the towering spires of Torghast, this is where the moss-worn Kyrian make their lair. Striking from above, they fling foolhardy interlopers into the darkness below. I would say this wing has a more black or dark gray color palette to it, and it is the first of the wings where you really feel like you're starting to get some height. Beyond that, we have Mortregar. Like the shifting and malformed terrain itself, the souls trapped within have lost all semblance of who they once were. The jailer's forces subject them to necromantic experiments, transforming them into horrible monstrosities. Again, this swing makes you feel like you're really high up and maybe even outside, with a very pronounced greenish-gray fog that makes it stand out from the other wings. Climbing even further, we have the upper reaches, which are the domain of the jailer's most devoted servants. Elite moss-worn forces and their Venthyr allies patrol these halls and maintain their master's most powerful defenses. This wing almost feels like a culmination of several wings that preceded it, with us returning inside but with a greenish-gray color palette and fires and weapons present everywhere. Those were the 6 normal wings, but if you performed well enough, then you could proceed to the Adamant Vaults. Most of this area has us again inside in cold metal hallways, but this time with a reddish tint, though it still manages to feel fairly distinct with an emphasis on traps like the rolling spike balls and Iron Maidens. And honestly, there are a ton of other distinctions that I'm just forgetting, or rather I'm forgetting which wing to attribute them to. Like those rooms where you have to run across the very narrow chains. I want to say those were in Mortregar, but I don't really remember. At any rate, this makes for 7 different wings of rooms that could be repurposed and stitched together. These dozens of individual rooms were encountered semi-randomly, and this helped generate the sense that Torghast was impossibly large and easy to get lost in, but I don't inherently think that that's the best approach. I prefer when we're able to get a sense for the layout of the locations we're visiting. My proposal would have been to reforge the best of these rooms together to form approximately 2 new dungeons, bringing the Shadowlands total up to 11, 12 if we're counting Tazavesh's too. But who knows, maybe Blizzard could handle it even better than I expect and we could get more dungeons out of it. And heck, some of these places have pretty cool names in and of themselves. Furthermore, remaining rooms and assets could be used to spruce up the Sanctum of Domination, which I found a bit lacking in design. Like, I was beside myself that the only use of chains as a walkway in the raid were during the Sylvanas fight and not during Trash. Yes, there was the occasional death to someone falling off of Thrall and Jaina's earth and ice bridges, but it's just not as hysterical when it's during progression on the last boss. I'd much rather see my guildmates swap blasting or life gripping people to their deaths. And I also just didn't like how much teleporting around there was in the raid. I think we definitely had enough to work with to create at least 2 dungeons with a bit left over, and that doing so would have helped give a sense for Torghast as an actual location in the game. So overall, I think Torghast had a lot to offer the game, and what we did get was well designed. It was just integrated suboptimally into the rest of the game. Sometimes you have all the right pieces and just needed a different way to assemble them. I hope the devs have recognized this and are better at pivoting going forward, and that players can recognize this when voicing their feedback for aspects of the game in the future. For this week's drawing, it only seemed natural to go with the master of Torghast himself, Zovaal, aka the Jailer. Granted, I could have gone with Sylvanas as she is the final boss of the Sanctum of Domination raid, but I want her for a different video topic and a different location, and I think it just makes more sense to draw Zovaal here than in the Sepulchre of the First One's raid where we face off against him. As you can see, I decided to draw him with his original look instead of his armored version. I think it brings a lot more to the table and is far more unique. I kind of suspect that Blizzard just saw all of the memes about the bald nipple man and hard pivoted away from that, but his original look at least stood out a little bit. With the armor, he's just as generic as you could possibly get as a big bad villain. And I'm absolutely not saying that Zovaal was a well-written character even when he wasn't wearing a shirt. Like, there was definitely some potential there, and I am going to talk about that in a future video, but they didn't actually do anything with that. He just acted incredibly evil, and then with his last gasp alluded to him actually trying to protect us from a greater threat. That is as unimaginative as you could possibly get. And obviously trying to retcon it so that he had his hand in every major lore event in WoW's history was a colossally stupid and colossally transparent attempt to try to get us to care about him. Nobody wants one character to be behind everything. It doesn't work with the old gods, and it doesn't work here. Of course, I gave him his signature gavel of the first arbiter. Let's not forget, Zovaal was the first arbiter. And I know he can use it as a flail, but he doesn't have to use it that way, and that was a pain to try to draw, so I gave up on that very quickly. And, you know, obviously I decided to draw him in Torghast. This specific spot happens to be in the Sanctum of Domination raid. After you take the elevator up from the 9, you start going down the stairs leading to either the Remnant of Ner'zhul or Soul Render Dormazane. And here you're sort of situated above Gorgoa as it feeds into Torghast and the souls wisp their way up to the top of the tower. Speaking of which, I decided not to draw him at the top of Torghast because although it is very iconic, it is also extremely large, so either the tower's features would have been unrecognizable, or Zovaal himself would have just been super tiny. Or I would have had to do some tricky worm's eye perspective shot. And I guess I just was not feeling that ambitious. Certainly not as ambitious as someone who wanted to rewrite the entire cosmos. And that's it for this video, so thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.